Hi there, my name is Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books. Today is an exciting day. As you can see, we're officially back in the kitchen. There is a book behind me as well as stuff for a recipe, and it is the return of my Bookish recipes. I took a little break from doing them. I've been kind of experimenting with some different videos on YouTube and figuring out what I really enjoy doing, and the Bookish recipes are probably my favorite. They do take a lot of work because I have to read books, find food mentions in the books, create recipes about the food, get all the ingredients, prepare the dish, etc. And it's a lot of work shooting recipes versus just a static video where I'm talking about books. That said, I really enjoy it. I love it. I think it's unique and fun, and I really wanted to bring it back. I have a whole backlist now of recipes from books that I've read, and I am anticipating shooting a bunch of them this month to kind of get a whole bunch queued up for you. So that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into the book today and the recipe that we're doing. The book that I read was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. This is a book about a character who was a count, and he is Count Alexander Rostov, and he is in the old Russia, I want to say in the 1930s, and there's the change of the aristocracy into the communist government, and during that transition he is basically put in a position where he is a prisoner, but he's treated a little bit better than some of the other prisoners because of his status and his connections. Instead of being sent to like a gulag or an internment camp, he is relegated to life in this hotel in Moscow. And it's a luxurious hotel. He has a nice room, he's friends with all the staff, he gets to eat incredible meals, drink lots of good wine. It's not like he is like horribly mistreated, but he is a prisoner. He isn't allowed to leave the hotel, and in subtle ways he's very critical of his predicament. I thought this was interesting because it's kind of a look from the inside into the transition into communism in Russia, and the way that the government works, kind of some of the ideology behind the politics in Russia. And I actually read it about a month and a half ago. This book, the reason I chose it for a recipe today is because it's full of so many excellent food passages. Amor Towles, I found out, is really into food and writing about food. He even actually has created his own recipes of some of the food that he mentions in some of his books, which I love. That's like a man after my own heart right there. Books and food, where can you go wrong? So in this particular book, there's many passages where the main character, Count Alexander, describes in great detail luxurious dishes. One that I found particularly interesting as a dish that I'm not really that familiar with was a Latvian stew. And the way it was described was a dish of pork and onions and apricots, and it sounded so tantalizing and decadent and delicious that I thought I would try to create my own version of it at home. Let me just read you really quick the passage where it comes from. If the young man were wise, he would send the bishop packing and ask the young lady to go on with her question. Instead, he dutifully picked up the menu. Perhaps he imagined that the perfect dish would leap off the page and identify itself by name. But for a hopeful young man trying to impress a serious young woman, the menu of the piazza was as perilous as the Straits of Messina. On the left was a scylla of lower-priced dishes that could suggest a penny-pinching lack of flair, and on the right was a char-de-bise of delicacies that could empty one's pockets while painting one pretentious. The young man's gaze drifted back and forth between these opposing hazards, but in a stroke of genius he ordered the Latvian stew. While this traditional dish of pork, onions, and apricots was reasonably priced, it was also reasonably exotic, and it somehow harkened back to that world of grandmothers and holidays and sentimental melodies that they had been about to discuss when so rudely interrupted. All have the same, said our serious young lady, the same. And then she glanced at her hopeful young acquaintance with a touch of that tenderness that Natasha had shown Pierre in War and Peace at the end of Volume 2. I love this whole passage. This is just a small example of the food description that occurs throughout this book, and to me it's very clear that this author loves food as he's writing, and that this character has a love of food. You can tell in the way that he compares the food to great Greek tragedies, and the way that he talks about the notes of the wine either clashing with or complementing the food. So let's go ahead and get into our Latvian stew. Let me show you what you need to get it started. For this recipe, we're going to need a couple things. So we are going to need a good pot for braising. I am using my Le Creuset braising dish, but just a standard pot would work well. You could actually even probably modify this recipe to do it in a crock pot. It probably would be a little bit thinner in terms of the broth, but you could always thicken that up when you got home. I think I'll add a modification to that for the recipe, so if you're a crock pot fan, you know how to do that. Otherwise, like I said, a nice braising dish or a regular pot will suffice. If you have something with enamel, that'll work perfectly. A spoon, cutting board, a knife, and we're gonna need a peeler as well. For ingredients, we're gonna have a pork shoulder. You could also use pork butt, that will be fine. Just in general, you're gonna want something that has a nice marbling of meat and fat. We are gonna be taking off this major fat cap here. However, you do want fat interspersed throughout the meat. Using something like a pork tenderloin will not be the right thing for this because the fat is actually gonna be part of what flavors the dish and what makes the meat tender and juicy instead of dry. In terms of braising, you want fat and you want tendons and things like that because that's what's going to make that meat luxurious and rich. As opposed to a quick cook, like when you cook a pork chop, you don't want a ton of fat on it and you don't want a ton of gristle or tendons or cartilage or anything because that's going to make that pork chop chewy because you're just cooking it really quick. There's no time for it to break down. But in a slow braising dish like this, whether you use pork, whether you use beef, lamb, whatever, you want to use something that's going to have good marbling because that's the stuff that's going to make it really, really taste good. We're going to need some carrots, some red wine, some apricots. I'm using yellow onions, garlic, red pepper flakes, black pepper, salt, cinnamon, smoked paprika, tomato paste, and olive oil. Now, traditionally, from what I saw, this recipe uses beer. I am going to go out on a limb here and do it with red wine. I think that the tannins of the red wine with the tomato paste, the onions, and a little bit of the sweetness of the apricots are going to create just a super luxurious stew. So if you're used to cooking a more traditional Latvian stew, don't come yell at me. This is only my version. This is, me playing with a recipe. I'm sure that with the beer, it's lovely. I'm just not a big beer fan myself, and so I don't have any on hand. So we're gonna do it with the red wine and see how it comes out. I think it'll be delightful. And if you're serving this at home, I would suggest serving this either with some boiled buttered potatoes, maybe like some little creamer potatoes, just boiled till they're tender and tossed with some butter and parsley. In my case, I'm actually gonna make some mashed potatoes, and I think, or if you wanted to do roast potatoes, I think that would work as well. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into this prepping and cooking process.
Talk to me nice, talk to me honestly. Look in my eyes, don't let it fall on me. Say you a good guy, make me believe it. Don't wanna hear it, I wanna see it. See how rewind, when we rewind, feels so nice. We time, you I know how to make me feel right. I can't help how. Got this sweet talk, I'm already on my way. I'm pulling up, don't be late. I'm cutting through all the lanes. Sweet talk, you need to say less to me. No need for no flowers, babe. I'm already on my way, on my way. Why you blushing? Yeah, sweet concussion. Oh, you miss my touching. Good to show me
I'm
something.
gonna use about half of this pork butt for this recipe. The reason being is that there's only 2 of us in my household, and if I cook this whole thing, we'll be eating this for like the rest of the week. I think for me and my partner, about that much will make probably 4 meals, so dinner tonight and lunch tomorrow, and that should be sufficient, or 2 dinners, whichever. And then I'll save the other half of this pork butt for something else down the road, or pork shoulder rather. So if you're wondering once it's cut why suddenly there's a much smaller quantity, that's why I'm just using half of this. But if you're going to do this recipe for the whole family, you have a bigger family and you need a bigger quantity, just double the recipe and then you could use a whole piece like this.
Be more than one thing, I need more than less than I do. Say you a good guy, make me believe it. Don't wanna hear it, I wanna see it. See how rewind, when we
sure our oven is preheated to 350 degrees because we are going to put this in the oven to braise. As you heard in my intro, my oven is definitely preheated. We're going to start slowly heating our cast iron. So we're going to put this on like a medium heat and let it heat up. If you're using a standard pot, don't worry about going through this slow preheating process. I just like with my enamel pot to make sure that I heat it a little bit slowly and not just crank it all the way up. While we wait for this to warm up, we're going to season up our pork chunks. I showed you in the video where I was cutting it, but sometimes pork shoulder has bone in it. I am going to keep the bone, obviously because there's still a lot of meat on it, even though I trimmed it up pretty well. And also because it will impart some flavor to the stew. Bones are great for flavor. Do not discard the bones during the cooking process. If anything, if you don't want the bones in the stew when you serve it, pull them out when it's serving time, but keep them for the flavor. We're going to season up this pork generously with some salt and a couple cracks of fresh black pepper. Okay, that should do. Just gonna toss that around and make sure it's nice and evenly coated. There we go. I was once told to salt meat like the road, you know, after an ice storm when they throw salt on the road to keep the ice from getting all gross. So I don't know if that's like the road. I'm from San Diego. I didn't live in the snow, but I took it to mean salt it, you know, pretty thoroughly. Our pot is starting to get nice and warm. We've got some olive oil in there heating up. We're going to go ahead and add some of our pork. Now, the important thing here is to not overcrowd your dish. I'm going to put a little bit in at a time, so maybe half. We're going to brown it off, and then we're going to switch it out. The reason that we're going to do that is if you throw all of this meat in here at once, it's not going to brown. It's going to steam and turn like that grayish color, and it's not going to impart that nice flavor that you get when you brown the meat properly. Now that our pan is heating up, we're going to go ahead and turn the heat up a little bit more. So what we're going to do first is we're going to brown off all this meat, and we're going to put it to the side, and then I'm going to go ahead and caramelize the onions. Caramelizing onions is a long, slow process if you want to do it correctly. The reason is that if you try to rush caramelizing onions, you do it on high heat and you brown them off really fast, they get kind of a bitter, not so nice taste. But if you take your time caramelizing your onions, let them cook down slowly until they get that golden brown, they get that kind of sweet, delicious, caramely taste to them. And that's how we're going to do it. So we're going to brown this off first, and then we're going to remove all the meat, and then we'll come back with the onions after that. So I ended up cooking off the pork in 3 batches just to make sure we were not overcrowding. So I'm working on my 3rd batch right now. You can see we're getting some nice color. This is enough golden color. We're not looking for it to be like dark brown, just enough to get a little bit of flavor on the meat and build up a layer of soot at the bottom of the pan. If you've watched my previous Bookish recipes, then you'll know that the soot is this stuff that sticks at the bottom of the pan. And that is in essence a layer of flavor for your dish. That is a good thing. I have oddly seen some people cook their stuff, put it into a bowl, and then clean that off the bottom of the pan. And I was horrified because that is literally the layer of flavor. That's like all the good stuff that's going into the sauce and the gravy. So we're gonna finish this last batch off and we're gonna remove that. And then when we add the onions to let them start caramelizing, the juice that releases from the onions is actually gonna help release that layer of flavor at the bottom of the dish. And it's gonna meld into the food and meld into the base of the stock and really give us, you know, lots of nice, beautiful layers of flavor. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and add our onions. You can see we've got our nice layer of browning on the bottom of the pan from the pork. That's gonna give this beautiful, deep richness to the dish. We're gonna put all of our onions in. And we're gonna caramelize these slowly. So now this process is a little bit different than the previous process. The previous process, we're trying to brown off the meat via the Maillard reaction, which is that brown color on the outside of the meat. And that requires high heat. For the onions, we are actually gonna be lowering the heat. I've lowered it back down to medium. And we want these to cook slowly. We do not want these to brown in the same way that the meat browns, because if they do brown that way, they're going to become bitter. So pour yourself a glass of wine, throw your onions in, relax, let them cook slowly. It's gonna take about probably 15 minutes for them to get nice and soft and caramely and to release their juices and pull up all that flavor on the bottom of the dish. So don't rush it, take your time. Want those beautiful, sweet, delicious onions. Right, so you can see our onions are starting to get nice and caramely brown. I am not gonna take them super, super dark because I just want them to get to that point where they're sweet. And I'm gonna keep cooking them anyways because we're gonna saute off our carrots just a little bit. We're gonna add our carrots in. This shape that we've cut them in is called an oblique cut. I will provide some info on how to cut an oblique in the description. This is a cut that is used for making your pieces kind of similar in size, and it looks pretty in presentation instead of just like a standard circle cut. So we're gonna give our carrots a quick little saute here with our onions. We're gonna let them cook down just a little bit. And while that's going, we're gonna go ahead and open up our tomato paste. So everything in this particular dish is about building layers of flavor. We're gonna brown the pork for a layer of flavor. We're gonna caramelize the onions for a layer of flavor. We're gonna saute the carrots a little bit for a layer of flavor. And now we're gonna add the tomato paste, and we're gonna actually caramelize the tomato paste as well. And that is also gonna add a layer of flavor. My can opener does not want to cooperate with me today. There we go. So, just these onions caramelizing smell so good in here. This is like one of my absolute favorite smells. So we're gonna add in a generous little portion of tomato paste, about half of our little can there. And we're gonna let this caramelize just for a couple minutes. The sugars and the tomatoes naturally caramelize and add a good bit of flavor. I'm gonna pour our red wine over here. So you're just gonna move it around, let that caramelize, and you can smell it as it caramelizes. You can smell kind of this very fragrant, I don't know how to explain it. You can just kind of smell the sugars and the tomatoes. So I usually like to caramelize it just on one side because I feel like if you mix it in with all the other stuff caramelizing, it just kind of turns into a mess and doesn't cook evenly. This smells so good. Between that caramely smell from the onions and the smell from the tomatoes caramelizing, oh, this is going to be delightful. So I'm happy with where that is. So we're going to add our garlic cloves now. And we're just going to give these a little quick cooking. I like to saute my garlic just until you can smell it. Literally, once you can smell it, it's good. If you saute it too much longer, it can get a little bit bitter as well. Now we're going to start incorporating everything together, mix it all up so it's evenly dispersed. And we're going to return our pork. Get that all in there. We're gonna add our wine. Got about 2 cups of red wine here. I'm gonna cook that down for a few minutes. So what we're gonna do is we're going to reduce this. I'm gonna let that red wine simmer and then just reduce it until it gets like thick and syrupy. And we'll add some water in, the apricots, and I'm gonna add the seasoning as well. So I like a smoked paprika. Maybe traditional would be sweet paprika. That's more of a Eastern European thing, but I like the smokiness of this and it adds another layer into this stew. We're gonna add just a tiny, tiny pinch of cinnamon, not a whole lot. We don't want this to taste like a streusel. We just want it to have a hint of cinnamon. And we're gonna add, nope, my chili flakes are not open. We're gonna add a tiny pinch of chili flakes if I can get this container open. Can you open this for me? This is where it happens to be helpful to have the boyfriend handy. So we're gonna add just a tiny little pinch I have to be very, very light on the chili flakes because my partner is very spice averse. But anyways, I don't think this is supposed to be a super spicy dish. I think just a little bit of heat brings out some of the flavors in it, but I don't think it needs to be like ass-searingly hot. Okay. So, oh, this is looking beautiful already. Look at that nice deep color between the browned off tomato broth, the tomato paste, and then the red wine. It's gonna be such a deep, rich stock. All right, we're gonna let that reduce down for a couple minutes. And like I said, once it has reduced slightly, we will add the water, the apricots, and then we're gonna pop it into the oven and let it cook. Our stew is thickening up nicely. As you can see, the wine is starting to reduce. Everything is covered in this beautiful brown gravy. So it is time for us to add the apricots. Now, I know that this sounds kind of a strange combination to an American palate, adding apricots into a stew. But the sweetness of the onions, the sweetness of the carrots, the caramelized tomato paste, and then the like little hints of cinnamon and smoked paprika are actually going to go super, super well with apricot. And pork, incidentally, also goes really well with apricot. So I think that this dish is kind of a genius concoction. Got some sweet, smoky, salty, a little bit of everything. It's going to be a very umami sort of flavor. So we're adding in our apricots. I actually cut my apricot pieces in half just because the ones that were in the package were quite large, and I feel like it would be a little out of balance to have a massive hunk of apricot like that. I think like these little half pieces will work just a little better. So we're gonna mix those in. Gosh, this smells so good already. Like the notes of the smokiness from the paprika, the cinnamon, just a little hint of cinnamon in there, and the garlic and everything. Ugh, literally my mouth is watering. And we're just going to top this off with just a little bit of water. Not a whole lot. If you have chicken stock handy, you could do that instead, or even beef stock really would be okay. In this case, there's so much flavor already going on, and I don't have pork stock. I don't have any defrosted chicken stock, so I'm just going to add a little water. And add a little bit more there. Okay. Get this all nicely mixed together. Make sure everything is in the sauce. I'm going to just check the level of the spices really quick. Make sure. Oh yeah, everything's right where I want it. A little tiny bit of heat, tomatoiness, smokiness. Can just barely taste the cinnamon. Perfect. I think these are going to meld together really, really well as it cooks. So we're going to add or put the lid on. And then we are going to go ahead and pop this into the oven. Again, we're going to be at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Pop this bad boy in there. And then we are essentially going to forget about this for the next hour and a half. We will probably check in maybe at the 45-minute mark to taste the seasoning again, check and see if it needs some pepper or, any adjustments before it's like cooked all the way to the end. And then we'll put it back in for 45 minutes. And after that, dinner should be ready. In the meantime, I'm gonna get a pot of mashed potatoes started. You won't see that because that's not that exciting, making mashed potatoes. And I think almost everyone knows how to do that. We'll be back in about an hour and a half's time to see the finished product. This smells absolutely amazing. Oh yes, look at that. I'm just gonna move this around a little bit. Oh, that is some sexy, sexy stuff going on in there. Oh, it smells just insanely good. You can smell the apricots and the cinnamon and the paprika and everything. We're gonna check the seasoning real quick. Oh. I want to cuss. That's so good. Oh. All right, we're gonna add a little bit of salt, just a little bit. We don't want this to be salty. We want kind of that sweetness to be the predominant flavor, but we do want to add a little bit of salt. Now don't stress about the layer of grease that's forming on the top here. At the end, we're gonna skim that off when we finish the dish. Okay, so it's been about 45 minutes. We're gonna give it another 45 and then we will take it out, thicken up the sauce a little bit, finish off our mashed potatoes, and we'll be good to go. All right, this smells so insanely good. Oh, look at that. So what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna put this on the heat on the stovetop for a minute. And we're gonna thicken the sauce up a little bit. So we're just gonna let it boil and let some of the liquid evaporate a little until it thickens right to where we want it. Set the lid over here. As you can see, in the meantime, I made some nice mashed potatoes to go with this. And so we just have to finish this up. Look at that, that is beautiful. Everything in here looks so tender and juicy. All the meat's nice and tender. Oh yeah, this is good. So we're just gonna bring this up to a quick boil. I'm gonna skim some of this oil off the sides here. So if you need to skim oil, just wanna take a ladle. I usually just put it into like a little coffee cup. You just go along the edges here like that. And skim the oil right off. This smells crazy good. Like, I can't even really describe it. It's tomato, the onion. You can really smell the apricots in this. It, I think, is going to be just extraordinarily delicious. Or if you're like my grandmother was and you have like a little oil separator, you can always use one of those. But I think that this works just fine. Can't get every tiny little bit of oil, but you can get most of it. Alright, so we're just going to let this reduce just a tiny bit. Let this down just a little. You don't need it to go super crazy. And look at those apricots are nice and tender. They're falling apart. Meat's nice and tender. Everything is just beautiful in here. And the carrots, they're tender, but they held their shape. I'm gonna let this simmer for about 5 minutes probably just to thicken up, and then we're gonna serve it, try it, and say goodnight. So as we can see, our sauce has thickened up pretty nicely. And I'm gonna go ahead and just check it one last time to make sure that the seasoning is right. It should be good because we checked it at 45 minutes, adjusted the seasoning a little bit, but you never know, so. Oh, that is delightful. Sweet, salty, tiny bit of heat from the chili flake, that umami flavor from the meat. Oh, that is wow. Over some mashed potatoes, this is about to be bomb. All right, I have got to go ahead and plate some of this up so I can eat it like right this minute. Again, this has been Latvian stew, which is a pork and apricot stew inspired by A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Tolls. Like I said earlier, this is pretty relevant to the current situation with Russia and Ukraine, in that this is critical of the Russian government and critical of some of the hypocrisy within, Of course, it is historical fiction, so it's not 100% accurate, and it is based in history, but it does show some of the issues within communist government, you know, since way back when. And if you're like me and you love food description, this is a must read. It's honestly, the character is so charming, the writing is beautiful, but the food gets me. So that's enough about that. Let me try this first bite while it's still hot. Let's go for some of the meat with an apricot first. And I cannot tell you how amazing this smells. It's like sweet and spicy and oh. Oh. That is perfection. That meat is so tender. The apricot just like melted in my mouth with it. Just extraordinary. Let's get a little bit of everything. That is like an insane plate of comfort right there. It is so, it's like something that I feel like my grandma could have cooked, except it wasn't my grandma. I don't know how to explain it. It's like the kind of dish that you would get in somebody's grandmother's kitchen. Like it feels homey and comforting, rich, flavorful. Oh, this is extraordinarily delicious. And like I said, for Americans, I know that's kind of weird to have fruit in a stew. Don't be put off by it. It is so good. So good. The flavor balance is insane. Definitely try this out. So it's about 9:30 at night and this is my dinner. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. Comment down below, have you ever had Latvian stew? Have you had anything that's similar? Can you think of any dishes that have like that fruit savory sort of thing going on? And if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button down below. I post regular bookish content and I'm going to be posting regular bookish recipes as well. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel, Bandy's Books. Bye.
Oh yeah.
Hot?
Can get married now.
I can get married now.
Yep.
Have you had anything like this before?
In South Africa, but it was not pork. It was kind of a goat dish. It was very good as well. But this is, I mean, I love pork, so.
How do you like the pork with the apricot?
It's good. Gives it kind of a sweet flavor and the sour of the something else here.
There you heard it. Boyfriend tested and approved. Good night.